Imagine waking up one day to find out Earth is no longer yours. Mysterious glowing orbs land across the planet, shutting down all technology, and an unstoppable force begins wiping out everything in its path. But here's the real kicker. This isn't an alien invasion, it's an extermination. One woman, a defiant scientist, is humanity's last hope. Will she convince our otherworldly visitors that we're worth saving? Or is this the end of civilization as we know it? Buckle up, because this story will leave you questioning everything. In the year 1928, a lone traveler sets up camp amidst the rugged expanse of the Karakoram Mountains in India. As he prepares to rest, an unusual glow flickers beyond his tent, drawing his attention. Curiosity overcomes hesitation, and he steps outside to investigate, soon coming face to face with an enormous luminous orb, partially encased in a fragile layer of ice. Entranced by the eerie sight, he raises his pickaxe and strikes at the surface. The instant his tool makes contact, an overwhelming force hurls him backward, rendering him unconscious as the sphere radiates with intensified brilliance. When he regains consciousness, the mysterious object has vanished, but a peculiar scar now marks his skin. Decades slip by, and the year is now 2008. Dr. Helen Benson, a distinguished astrobiologist, teaches at Princeton University. After a long day of lectures, she returns home to her stepson, Jacob, who has remained emotionally distant since the loss of his father. That evening, an unexpected call disrupts their routine. A cryptic voice informs her that a vehicle is en route to collect her. Moments later, law enforcement officers encircle her home, and an FBI agent appears at the doorstep, demanding that she accompany him immediately. Helen hesitates, unwilling to leave Jacob alone, but a concerned neighbor arrives, offering to watch over him. Reluctantly, Helen complies and is ushered into an unmarked vehicle. Despite her persistent inquiries, the agent remains tight-lipped. Their journey ends at an airfield, where Helen finds herself among a gathering of experts from various disciplines, physicists, engineers, and biologists, all equally bewildered by their sudden summoning. Without explanation, they are transported via helicopter to Linwood Military Academy in New Jersey. Upon arrival, the military confiscates their cell phones, but Helen discreetly conceals hers beneath her clothing. Soon, she is approached by an old acquaintance, Michael Granier, who reveals that her inclusion in this critical assembly is due to her past collaboration with Dr. Carl Adams, a leading researcher in astrophysical phenomena. The assembled scientists are soon briefed on the unfolding crisis. An unidentified extraterrestrial object hurtles toward Earth at an incomprehensible velocity, its trajectory placing it on a direct collision course with Manhattan. Due to its immense speed, neutralizing the object is not an option, leaving them with a mere hour to prepare for an impending disaster that could claim millions of lives. As tension escalates, Helen retreats to a restroom, where she secretly uses her phone to warn Jacob, instructing him to take shelter in the basement. A soldier overhears her conversation, but, instead of reporting her, requests to borrow the phone to contact her own family. The team is soon transported to the anticipated impact site, where all monitoring systems struggle to categorize the approaching entity. Moments before impact, they brace for catastrophe, but to their collective shock, no collision occurs. Instead, a radiant orb of energy materializes above Central Park, descending gently until it touches the ground. Chaos erupts as onlookers flee in terror, while the scientific team, clad in protective suits, cautiously approaches. The air hums with an unidentified electromagnetic presence. Military forces swiftly arrive, weapons drawn, surrounding the enigmatic sphere. A sudden burst of light erupts from within the orb, and a figure emerges. Helen steps forward, extending her hand in a gesture of peace, but before she can make contact, a soldier fires his weapon. The being collapses into Helen's arms, wounded and bleeding an unfamiliar substance. As panic ensues, a towering mechanical entity steps out of the luminous sphere. The construct emits an energy wave that disrupts all electronic devices, rendering vehicles and weaponry inoperative. A high-frequency sound reverberates through the air, incapacitating the surrounding forces. Just as the situation escalates, the injured alien raises a trembling hand, signaling the mechanical guardian to stand down. Instantly, the disruptions cease and power is restored. The extraterrestrial being is rushed to a military research facility, though medical personnel are baffled by how to treat its injuries. As time slips away and the alien's condition worsens, Helen insists they call in a surgeon to extract the bullet. During the procedure, the surgeon discovers something astonishing. The creature's external layer is not skin, but an organic exoshell. As the layer peels away, the being beneath appears strikingly human. Now encased in a containment unit, the alien drifts into a restless sleep. As Helen watches, the being suddenly awakens in a panic. Speaking in a soothing tone, Helen reassures him that he is safe, and he gradually calms down. To her amazement, he is identical to the mountaineer from 1928. Though still weak, the alien utters fragmented phrases, repeating Helen's words. Meanwhile, outside the lab, global hysteria intensifies. Stock markets crash, mass evacuations begin, and governments scramble for control. The president and his advisors retreat to an undisclosed location, while the Secretary of Defense, Regina Jackson, convenes an emergency meeting. Intelligence agencies report that extraterrestrial spheres identical to the one in Central Park have begun landing worldwide. Alarmingly, a classified military satellite has been compromised, exposing strategic defense secrets. At the lab, scientists analyze biological samples from the alien, uncovering an unprecedented revelation. Its genetic composition includes human DNA, along with traces of 2 other unidentified species. It appears the extraterrestrials had visited Earth before, acquiring genetic material, explaining the decades-old scar on the mountaineer and the alien's uncanny human appearance. Helen and a group of researchers visit the alien, who now speaks perfect English. Introducing himself as Klaatu, he explains that he represents an intergalactic consortium. He requests an audience with the United Nations to address the world's leaders directly, but Regina refuses, perceiving him as a threat. Her paranoia escalates, leading her to authorize an injection of truth serum in hopes of extracting classified information. Feigning compliance, Helen is entrusted with administering the injection but discreetly swaps the serum with saline. As she whispers to Klaatu, urging him to flee, she is abruptly escorted away. Meanwhile, Klaatu is restrained in an interrogation room and subjected to a lie detector test. Utilizing his abilities, he manipulates the device, sending a surge of energy that incapacitates the interrogator. Seizing control of the man's mind, Klaatu extracts information about the facility's security layout. With calculated precision, Klaatu disables surveillance systems, emits an ultrasonic pulse that renders nearby guards unconscious, and calmly exits amidst the ensuing chaos. Elsewhere, Helen covertly retrieves a tissue sample of the alien's discarded exoshell, while Regina mobilizes an all-out search operation. Eventually, Klaatu arrives at a train station, where a sea of stranded travelers clamors over delayed departures. Observing human behavior, he notes the growing aggression among individuals. Weak from his injuries, he stumbles into a restroom, where he discovers his wound is worsening before collapsing. Moments later, Helen receives an urgent call. Someone at the station is asking for her by name. Realizing it must be Klaatu, she rushes to his location and discreetly ushers him into her car. Inside, Klaatu meets Jacob, whose demeanor is cold and dismissive. Unfazed, Klaatu requests the sample of his discarded exoshell. With a mere touch, he applies the organic material to his wound, which instantly begins to heal. As the U.S. military prepares an assault on the colossal biomechanical entity, it immediately perceives the incoming threat. With uncanny precision, it overrides the military's weapon systems, seizing control of every piece of machinery and rendering it useless within moments. Their attacks prove futile, leaving military officials in a state of helplessness, unable to devise an effective countermeasure. Meanwhile, Helen follows a specific route under Klaatu's direction. Along the way, Jacob observes the endless stream of vehicles evacuating the city and voices his resentment toward the extraterrestrials. He expresses his belief that they should be eradicated, insisting that if his father were alive, he would have fought them. Eventually, they arrive at a quiet stop, and while Jacob steps away to use the restroom, Klaatu takes the opportunity to ask Helen about her family. She explains that Jacob's father, a military engineer, passed away, and his biological mother died in childbirth. Now, Jacob is in her care, though their relationship remains strained. The trio enters a small roadside diner, where Klaatu meets a man named Mr. Wu, another extraterrestrial who has spent the past 70 years disguised as a human, observing Earth's inhabitants. Mr. Wu shares his findings, stating that while humans exhibit reckless tendencies and an aversion to change, he has also witnessed their capacity for kindness and resilience. Despite agreeing with Mr. Wu's bleak assessment, Klaatu informs him that the mission will proceed. However, Mr. Wu refuses to leave Earth, choosing to remain with the family he has built over the decades. Meanwhile, military scientists attempt to contain the dormant biomechanical guardian by encasing it within fortified barriers, hoping to neutralize its influence. Public hysteria grows as authorities declare Klaatu a fugitive, urging citizens to report any sightings. Back on the road, Helen, Jacob, and Klaatu travel toward a secluded location in New Jersey. Upon arrival, Klaatu instructs Helen to stop the vehicle and steps into the forest. Concerned, Helen follows, leaving Jacob behind. Suddenly, an eerie swarm of bioluminescent insects swirls past her, leading her to a nearby lake where Klaatu stands gazing at the water's surface. From the depths, another luminous sphere emerges. Activating a hidden protocol, Klaatu triggers a response from the countless other spheres stationed across the planet. Helen watches in shock as the orbs begin their ascent, departing Earth. The only one that remains is the sphere in which Klaatu originally arrived. When Klaatu returns to the car, he requests that Helen drive him back to the city, but she refuses until he explains his true intentions. He finally reveals that his mission is not to negotiate with humans, but to preserve Earth by eliminating the very species threatening its survival. Since habitable planets are rare, their civilization has deemed it necessary to intervene before irreversible damage is done. Helen is horrified, pleading with Klaatu to reconsider, insisting that humanity has the capacity for change. He remains unconvinced, stating that they have observed humans for centuries with no meaningful progress. Furthermore, the process has already begun, and there is no turning back. At that moment, a passing police officer stops upon recognizing Klaatu. Drawing his weapon, he demands their surrender. Alarmed, Jacob begs Klaatu not to harm the officer. Without hesitation, Klaatu assures him the man's suffering will be brief before using his abilities to send Helen's car hurtling toward the officer, pinning him against the ground. Jacob panics, but within seconds, Klaatu channels energy from the vehicle, reviving the officer as if using a defibrillator. He clarifies that he never intended to cause harm, only to eliminate obstacles. Helen remains determined to prove that humanity is worth saving. She suggests taking Klaatu to meet someone who might change his mind. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts monitor satellite footage, uncovering a shocking discovery. The glowing spheres have been transporting Earth's diverse species off the planet, akin to an ark safeguarding life before an impending catastrophe. This revelation leads Regina Jackson to conclude that a cataclysmic event is imminent. Elsewhere, military scientists attempt to analyze the massive biomechanical entity, encasing it deep underground. Unbeknownst to them, the structure begins to fracture, revealing something sinister. Within the cracks, microscopic robotic organisms, nanites, rapidly multiply, consuming the very tools used to examine them. Without warning, the entity disintegrates, unleashing a self-replicating swarm of nanobots that devour everything in their path. The base is completely overrun, with personnel and structures reduced to dust in mere moments. As the crisis escalates, Helen and Klaatu arrive at the home of Carl Barnhart, a renowned Nobel Prize-winning scientist. Inside, Carl notices Klaatu analyzing an unfinished mathematical equation on a chalkboard. Without hesitation, the two begin working together to solve the problem, their intellectual synergy evident. Observing this interaction, Carl deduces Klaatu's extraterrestrial origins. Meanwhile, Jacob, watching television, sees a hotline urging citizens to report sightings of Klaatu. Feeling conflicted, he ultimately decides to call the authorities, believing it is what his father would have done. When Helen discovers his betrayal, she desperately tries to make him understand that his father is gone, and they must forge their own path. Overcome with emotion, Jacob breaks down. Moments later, military helicopters descend upon Carl's residence. Realizing their time is up, Helen, Klaatu, and Jacob make a swift escape. As they flee, Carl urges Helen to change Klaatu's perspective, not through words, but through actions. In a desperate bid to evade capture, the trio takes refuge in the woods. However, Jacob steps into an open clearing, waving his arms to signal the helicopters. Tearfully, he confesses to Helen that he called the authorities because he thought it was the right thing to do. Helen, heartbroken, reminds him that their survival depends on their choices now, not on past ideals. Before they can react, Special Forces seize Helen, whisking her away. Meanwhile, at the military base, researchers continue their futile efforts to combat the ever-expanding nanite swarm. The destructive cloud now spreads across entire cities, reducing buildings, vehicles, and people to nothing. Every attempt to halt their advance only accelerates their replication. Recognizing the urgency, Regina Jackson releases Helen, allowing her one final attempt to reason with Klaatu. Escorted by Michael, she reunites with Jacob and Klaatu in a remote forest cabin. Jacob, now seeing Klaatu in a new light, expresses regret for his actions and asks for forgiveness. Moved by the boy's sincerity, Klaatu begins to question his own beliefs. They soon arrive at a cemetery, where Jacob begs Klaatu to resurrect his father. Despite his immense power, Klaatu explains that such an act is beyond his limits. Devastated, Jacob lashes out, but Helen's comforting embrace helps him find closure. Witnessing this deeply human moment, Klaatu begins to see the potential for change. Meanwhile, the nanite swarm engulfs New York City, consuming everything in its wake. With no other option, Regina informs the president that they are negotiating peace, but desperate, the president orders renewed military strikes. As Helen, Jacob, and Klaatu race towards Central Park, military forces attempt to block their path, but Klaatu disables their vehicles, ensuring their passage. Upon arrival, they find the area deserted. Only the final remaining sphere remains. At that moment, a massive bombing campaign begins, igniting an inferno across the park. Their car flips in the chaos, and tragically, Michael perishes. As the nanite swarm encroaches, Jacob and Helen succumb to its effects, their bodies beginning to disintegrate. Helen pleads for help, and without hesitation, Klaatu channels his power, extracting the invasive nanites from their bodies and absorbing them into himself. Now fully convinced of humanity's potential, Klaatu makes his way toward the sphere. Bracing himself, he steps into the swirling mass of nanobots. As he reaches out to the sphere, his body dissolves, unaliving himself to halt the destruction. With his final act, the swarm ceases, their remnants falling to the ground as lifeless dust. As the sphere begins its ascent, Earth falls into eerie silence. Technology worldwide shuts down, a final price for humanity's recklessness. Helen and Jacob, standing amidst the wreckage, watch as the sphere departs. Jacob, in a whisper, suggests that Klaatu's essence lingers. Perhaps, in some way, he is still with them. And just like that, Earth was spared, but at what cost? With all technology gone and humanity left to rebuild from the ashes, one question lingers: will we ever learn from our mistakes? Klaatu's final act gave us a second chance, but was it our last? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you love epic sci-fi stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more jaw-dropping movie recaps.